funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
I'm Paul Wright and you're listening to the 5th programme of Greening the White House, the 7-part series which explores the island of Ireland ancestry of various US presidents, with a key focus on the ancestral homesteads and locations linked to them in Ireland. In our last programme we investigated the County Antrim roots of the 21st US President Chester Alan Arthur, as well as the County Tyrone roots of the 28th US President Woodrow Wilson. In this programme the spotlight falls on the 35th US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who served in high office from 1961 to 1963. Believe it or not, all 8 of JFK's great-grandparents came from Ireland. To find out more, I recently visited the Kennedy Homestead and Visitor Centre in Dunganstown, County Wexford, and got talking with Patrick Grennan, who is himself a 4th cousin of JFK.
So JFK's great-grandfather Patrick Kennedy left here during the famine, and he went to Boston. His older brother James and John and sister Mary stayed in Dunganstown. We know there was at least 2 generations here before they were around. So we trace back to a Patrick Kennedy who was here in 1707.
The Patrick Kennedy who left Dunganstown in 1848 during the height of the Great Irish Famine was one of JFK's 8 great-grandparents, all of whom came from Ireland. Patrick Grennan.
The President's 8 great-grandparents left Ireland during the famine and went to Boston. So we start off with a family tree with his 8 great-grandparents and his 4 grandparents. So all of JFK's ancestors came from Ireland. So I don't know if it's unique, but his 8 great-grandparents arrived in Boston within 3 years of each other. So he's completely a product of the famine emigration in one sense.
So just how bad were things in Ireland during the Great Famine of the mid-19th century, when all 8 of JFK's great-grandparents quit Ireland for America? Professor Liam Kennedy of the University of Ulster.
In the 1840s you have close to 8.5 million people on the island, the highest level of population ever. About a third of those were almost totally dependent on the potato crop, and over half, I would think, largely dependent on the potato crop. So what we have, in a way, is an ecological disaster that destroys the primary foodstuff of the people.
The Great Famine.
It actually devastated Ireland.
You had a population that was consistently on the edge of doom.
People were really on the verge of starvation.
For a large majority of the population, they were on the brink of disaster.
It is the first time in Europe that you have a famine on this particular scale, which is affecting such a large percentage of the population.
And although JFK's ancestors fled in Ireland in dire straits, nevertheless, within a short period, their descendants had progressed rapidly in their newly adopted home of the United States. Patrick Grennan.
Kind of what's I find very interesting, a child of those 8 people. So you have 4 families, Kennedys, Hickeys, Hannons and Fitzgeralds. All 4 families by 1890 had a serving elected representative in Boston. So within one generation of arriving in Boston, all 4 families are into elected office. And I suppose if you consider the 4 families would have had cousins, first cousins back here in Ireland in 1890, still with no vote and still not in a position to own property, and their cousins in Boston are one. Well, like Honey Fitzgerald is mayor of Boston, P.J. Kennedy served in the state senate, Hickey, JFK's Hickey grandfather, was a mayor of a town outside Boston, and Mary Hannon was also, they were involved in politics.
And getting back to JFK's original 8 great-grandparents from Ireland, I also asked Patrick Grennan what kind of lives they might have lived in Ireland before emigrating to the United States.
Well, I've seen the research on the 8 emigrants, and we don't exactly know, they were all from tenant farming backgrounds. I'd be fairly familiar with Patrick and Bridget.
That being the same Patrick Kennedy mentioned earlier, who left County Wexford in 1848 during the famine, and later married Bridget Murphy, who also came from County Wexford.
Bridget's, most of her family went out. when Patrick arrived in Boston, he started working in a cooperage. But there was about 6 or 7 of Bridget's first cousins working with him. We're presuming Bridget's entire family were involved in coopering in New Ross. And we know her first cousin, Michael Byrne, was in Boston in 1840. So he seems to have gone out, got a job, and sent word back and brought his cousins and extended family out to Boston. So I don't know if they were starving before they went, but they definitely went, I suppose, for gain and to quite a good job in Boston. So I suppose that put them in the front foot straight away. We're presuming Patrick and Bridget were introduced by Bridget's cousins who he'd worked with while he was working in a cooperage, and I'm fully convinced Patrick followed Bridget to Boston. He had 31 acres rented from the landlord, and like if you're to profile most of the immigrants that left during the famine, very few would have left 31 acres behind. And so his brother James ended up renting that bit of property, but Patrick technically, you would imagine, could have stayed. So I'd imagine he went out to Bridget more than anything, and straight to a job. And like not long after they arrived in Boston, they were in position to open a grocery store. But Patrick did die 10 years after arriving in Boston, leaving Bridget with 4 kids. And she was quite a remarkable lady. She continued to run the grocery store herself, and her husband had set up. She had a second job hairdressing for society ladies in Jordan Marsh. She was paying a tutor to educate her children, which showed the foresight she had. And she also opened a saloon next door to the grocery store.
Wow, that's a formidable businesswoman.
Yeah, quite a remarkable lady. She was also like, when we have records of when she passed away, she had quite substantial loans in banks. Now, most of the Irish immigrants wouldn't have been able to access loans in proper banks in Boston. There were signs up, no Irish. So Bridget seems to have had quite an in with the banking, that she was able to go in and get substantial loans to develop businesses.
So even at this stage, in the early roots of what was going to be the Kennedy dynasty, you can see where it's coming from. It didn't just fall from the sky, so to speak.
No. Like all 4 families were straight away involved in politics, you could say. And the Fitzgeralds and Hickeys were definitely a part of what you'd call the lace curtain Irish in Boston.
And staying with the Fitzgerald side of JFK's ancestry, to find out more about it, I recently visited the Thomas Fitzgerald Centre in Bruff, County Limerick, and talked with Paul Dennehy, chairperson of Bruff Heritage Group.
In 1852, a local man here by the name of Thomas Fitzgerald left Bruff to join his siblings who had immigrated to Boston. Thomas went and he settled in Boston. He married a woman from Cavan called Rosanna Cox. And both of them worked extremely hard and they prospered. Eventually they bought their own hardware store, and there was a public house onto the hardware store, and there was flats overhead which they renovated. And again, from pure hard work, they became very prosperous, and they became one of the most prosperous families in Boston around that time. One of their children was a man called John Fitzgerald, known as John Honeyfitz. And John Honeyfitz, from a very young age, became very interested in politics and joined the Democratic Party. Now, because of the wealth that his mother and father had built up, this enabled him to go to some of the best schools in Boston and become very well educated. He became a starring light in the Democratic Party in Boston, and he actually served as mayor of Boston on 3 terms, 2 of them consecutive, and one he was out of office for a while and then he came back in again and served a 3rd term, and he was also elected to the House of Representatives. Now, this was unprecedented for the first generation Irish to break through in the political circles in Boston, and he became a very, very well established figure. He in turn married, during his life, he married a woman called Josephine Hannon. Now, the unusual thing about this is that Josephine's people actually also came from Bruff. Her mother and father had also immigrated from Bruff around the 1850s. So here we have one place, one little town in County Limerick, providing 2 grandparents to the 35th President of the United States. John Honeyfitz and Josephine had a number of children, and among them was a young lady called Rose Fitzgerald. And as we all know, Rose went on to marry Joe Kennedy. And I think everyone knows the Kennedys then. Joseph was the eldest. Unfortunately, Joseph was killed during the war. The next in was John himself, who became the 35th President of the United States.
Okay, you've given the ancestry of JFK and especially the Bruff connection. Did JFK, the man himself who became the 35th President of the United States, Paul, did he ever visit Bruff?
He did. He visited here in 1947. In fact, every generation...
Not too many people know that, I'd say.
Every generation of the Fitzgerald Kennedy family has visited Bruff. John Fitzgerald Kennedy himself visited here in 1947, but at the time he was a young congressman.
And it's also worth noting that in addition to touching base with his Fitzgerald roots in Bruff, County Limerick, on his 1947 visit to Ireland, JFK also paid an unexpected visit to his Kennedy relatives in Dunganstown, County Wexford. Mary Murphy, tour guide in the Kennedy homestead and visitor centre.
1947, this young congressman all the way from the United States, arriving here out of sheer curiosity and on a very sentimental journey.
I'd say a lot of people must be surprised, like myself, Mary, they're saying, wow.
Yeah,
I knew about the 63 visit, but I didn't know that he came in 1947.
And that's what people love, because he didn't return, to make a big story of it because he became the president. He came here ever before he was the president, and to acknowledge his ancestral roots.
And Mary Murphy also had this to say, making reference to a copy of a letter on display in the Kennedy Homestead Museum, in which JFK describes his 1947 visit to his relatives in Dunganstown.
If you go back to 1947, that was a letter that he wrote to a friend of his describing the whole journey. And that letter in itself is interesting to read, and I always like to encourage the visitors to actually read that, because 1947, we lived in it was a very different world. 2 years outside of the Second World War, and the idea of John F. Kennedy at the age of 29 on a very sentimental journey, sourcing out his roots. That was phenomenal. To think that he made that effort when he came to Lismore Castle to visit his sister, that he made the effort to check out his genealogy and arrived here.
And 29, let's be honest, 29 years of age, most of us are not thinking about the ancestral roots, but here you are, he's saying, look, I'm here in Ireland, I'm going to touch base with my ancestral roots, and he goes to the effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of, and even thinking about 1947, as I spoke about a moment ago, 2 years outside of the Second World War, stops at the top of the road and want to know is there any Kennedys in the area. And of course the gentleman he spoke to said, yes, plenty of them, which one are you looking for? That in itself tells the story. And even sometimes, even with our visitors, what I like to say to them is to think about 1947, because it was a big world, whereas today we've come closer. Everything's much more accessible. 29 years of age, a young congressman arriving here, knocking on a door with some information, and was greeted by Mary for the first time, Mary Ryan. So that was phenomenal.
And what does he say in the letter for the behoof of the listeners there, Mary?
We're
looking at a copy now of the letter that he would have written on his return to the States, and he talks about his first visit to Ireland in 1947, a very enjoyable visit. What's the essence? It's a long letter, but what's the essence?
The essence of the story would be, for me, when I read it, because when I read this first, it blew my mind to think that who had he with him on the day? Only Pamela Churchill. And Pamela Churchill was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law. And even to think about that coming down this road in 1947. I just spoke to a gentleman earlier and I was questioning the fact, was electricity in Ireland? But it wasn't. So to think about 1947, 2 years outside the Second World War, and he said there, I spent an hour surrounded by the chickens, the pigs, etc., and I left in a flow of nostalgia and sentiment. And then, of course, he said here, this was not punctuated by the English lady turning to me as we drove away and saying, just like a tobacco road. And I think that offended him.
So she wasn't impressed, but he said, look, these are my people, this is my roots, and I'm proud of it.
But I think he must have forgiven her, because I often tell our visitors too, getting into a station wagon and heading back to Lismore Castle in 1947, it'd be a long journey with a silent treatment. So I have a feeling they may have made up somewhere along the line.
And veering away from JFK's County Wexford roots and getting back once more to his County Limerick ones, As was mentioned earlier, the first political heavyweight to emerge from the Fitzgerald side of the family tree was John Fitzgerald, otherwise known as John Honey Fitz, who was mayor of Boston for many years and also JFK's grandfather. Paul Dennehy of the Thomas Fitzgerald Centre in Bruff.
We mustn't forget that John Honeyfitz had an awful, very excellent influence on the generations of the family. And when John Fitzgerald Kennedy's daughter Caroline was here in 2013 and she was opening this centre, she remarked and made reference to the influence that her grandfather had and her mother on the family. And it's also noted.
In other words, the Fitzgerald side of the family was a huge factor in the
huge
political makeup of the legend of JFK.
It was, and it was, Caroline said here on the day, it was from the Fitzgerald side that the interest came in politics. The Kennedys were the good business people, but the Fitzgeralds were the politicians. And even in John F's early stages of his political career, it was actually John Honeyfitz, his grandfather, that acted as his campaign manager and advisor.
There's a lady who wrote an excellent book on the Kennedys. It's called The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys by Doris Cairns Goodwin, and she says you can't underestimate the impact the Hickeys had, like Patrick just marrying the Hickeys, like they're a pretty formidable family, and the Fitzgeralds' other half as well, the Hannons, like all four families. And she kind of claimed a lot of what they say Joe Kennedy achieved or is meant to have done or meant to have perpetrated should really be accounted to the four families.
Patrick Rennan of the Kennedy Homestead and Visitor Centre in County Wexford. In January 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And less than 3 years after becoming president, JFK paid a 4-day visit to Ireland in June 1963. So just how did that visit go? James Scannell of the Braecoolin Historical Society.
It was a marvellous experience. Part of the reason was that, of course, it was televised, and this was great. But it was a marvellous feeling that here was the President of America, an Irish-American President, coming to Ireland.
And here is some pertinent audio footage concerning that 1963 visit, which I recently recorded at the Kennedy Homestead and Visitor Centre in County Wexford.
June 26, 1963 is a memorable day in the life of Ireland. This is the day the Irish people anxiously awaited. For today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States, arrives among them.
He arrives in Ireland and we had the whole thing, Air Force One coming into Dublin Airport live. And of course the American National Anthem, and of course then the cavalcade through Dublin, the address to Dáil Éireann.
George Bernard Shaw, speaking as an Irishman, summed up an approach to life. Other people, he said, see things and say why. But I dream things that never were, and I say why not. It is that quality. It is that quality of the Irish, the remarkable combination of hope, confidence, and imagination that is needed more than ever today.
But he was a marvellous orator, and this was the whole thing, his oratory, the way he flicked the head and could lower and modulate the tone of his voice. Barack Obama in recent years is the same. He has the way of tossing the head, moderating his voice, making the point, addressing the people, eyeballing them. He had the same charisma, I think. A lot of probably old Kennedy supporters saw the same in Obama.
When John F. Kennedy came here as the President of the United States, and we spoke about 1947, but, you know, he came down this road in 1947, but again in 1963, came to the very same gateway, was greeted by Mary, no formalities.
That Mary being Mary Ryan, the third cousin of JFK, who hosted the President when he visited his ancestral Kennedy home in Dunganstown, County Wexford, in 1963. Back to Mary Murphy of the modern Kennedy Homestead and Visitor Centre.
And as he came, the people who were standing there all moved back with the greatest respect because, you know, he was the President of the United States. And what he did then was proved to the people as well that he brought them all forward. He wanted to be around them. And I mean, that was huge, huge honour for especially the locals here of 1963 and the President of the United States beckoning him to come and greet him and meet him. And again, that just gives you an idea of the gentleness of the Irish during that period, stepping back to give him respect. And he beckoned everybody forward.
And so John Fitzgerald Kennedy had visited the home of his ancestors. The visit may have been brief, but the people of Duncanstown regard it as a signal honour, and the story of that visit would no doubt be retold for decades around the firesides of County Wexford.
So just how significant was the 1963 JFK visit for Ireland and the Irish? Mary Murphy.
What this country gained from that moment of 1963, it gave Irish people hope. Well, I personally think it gave it hope. And you hear those stories coming through to the visitor because they tell you, oh, my mother was here, my father was there, I remember this, what they told me. And so it's all stories, and that's what you're hearing all the time is people's stories.
What kind of stories, Mary? Any in particular that stick out in your mind?
Yeah, it's amazing, really, the different types of stories. Because, for example, one day I remember this lady came along. She says, I was born the same day President Kennedy was here. Oh, my mother was pregnant on me when President Kennedy came to Ireland. So it's so many different stories that you hear. And then sometimes people come and say, oh, I hope we're going to have the tea and some fruitcake. Same as when President Kennedy had here in 63. So we do have fruitcake and we do have our tea and coffee.
It was very tremendously exciting, really brilliant, because he was a great orator and he captivated us.
Historian James Scannell.
And the fact he was Irish-American, that was it, that was the whole thing, and he'd come to Ireland. This is the first American president that had come to Ireland on a state visit.
I mean, even myself, I remember my own father telling me, it was a huge impact. That put Ireland globally and internationally on the map.
Mary Murphy. Here's Tony Gubbins of the Thomas Fitzgerald Centre in Bruff, County Limerick.
He was a very kind of a presentable, iconic figure, and he was very much at home amongst the people, if you like, So, I mean, he was one of their own, if you like.
It galvanised the people, it lifted us people, and we sort of never forgot it. We all remember JFK, the American anthem being belted out all the time. The cavalcade through Dublin, as I say, was really brilliant. And people turned out and cheered and clapped.
And one such person who was in Dublin city centre in mid-1963 to see and cheer JFK on was Rob Goodbody of the Quaker Historical Committee of Ireland.
A roar of the crowd, and around the corner came a motorcycle escort of about a dozen of our army guys on motorcycles, followed by about three limousines. Now Kennedy was sitting in the car. There was sort of word at the time that he was suffering with his back problems at the time, and we wouldn't be standing all the time. But I saw him. He was my side of the car, and he was waving out at the crowd as he passed by.
And what was it like to see the man in the flesh?
Because of all the excitement, we would all have been tied up with the excitement, the election, the fact that Kennedy had been elected. He was certainly within Ireland and with most of the world, he was a very popular president. He was there in the limelight constantly, and with an attractive wife, with small children, all the sort of things that you did not expect of an American president. So, as we were following the visit in the newspapers, on the news and the TV and everything, it was just a wow to see him for a nanosecond, and then he's gone. But a memorable thing for the rest of my life.
Now, we've heard how JFK's 1963 visit to Ireland galvanised the Irish nation and was hugely significant for most Irish people. But what did the 4-day visit mean to JFK himself? Mary Murphy.
He said they were the best 4 days of my life, and they were his words. And they were phenomenal words coming from the President of the United States. From a small island like this. I mean, we are a small island.
And Tony Gibbons had this to say about JFK's comments in Limerick on his last day in Ireland, before jetting back to the United States.
when he was speaking at the racecourse in Limerick that time, I mean, we have actually heard recordings of some of the things he said, and he mentioned that, it was his home place, if you like, and that he promised to return again, which of course didn't happen, but he certainly was very much impressed by the reception he got.
So I carry with me as I go the warmest sentiments of appreciation to all of you. This is a great country with a great people. And I know that when I'm back in Washington, that I can, while I not see you, I will see you in my mind and feel all of your good wishes, as we all will in our hearts. Last night somebody sang a song which says the words of which I'm sure you know, which come back to Erin, Mavourneen, come back, Maroon, to the land of thy birth. Come with the shamrock in the springtime, Mavourneen. This is not the land of my birth, but it's the land for which I hold the greatest affection. And I certainly will come back in the springtime.
And although JFK's historic visit to Ireland occurred many years ago, nevertheless it left a huge legacy. For example, nowadays there's a veritable Kennedy industry in County Wexford, centred around New Ross and the nearby Kennedy homestead in Duncanstown. New Ross local historian Miles Courtney.
The JFK legacy, or the memory here in New Ross, is commemorated through the JFK Arboretum. Beautiful, beautiful Arboretum, just about 4 or 5 miles outside the town. You can walk the grounds there or go up onto Slieve Caillte where you can get a panoramic view of the southeast. Underneath it is the JFK homestead, the Kennedy homestead in Duncanstown. Coming into the town, recently we have a school, the local vocational college changed its name to Kennedy College. We have the Jfk statue on the quay, on the boardwalk in New Ross. People, you can hardly go by any day without somebody there posing for a photograph and shaking his hand. We have the lectern where he made his speech on the quay as well. There's a lectern on it, and inscribed in it is his speech on the day, and you can pose there and read his speech as well. The Dunbrody famine ship, although it's not Kennedy per se, it's run by a group called the JFK Trust. And also a huge event here every year is the JFK Summer School. It attracts people from all over the world.
And to discover more about other US presidents with ancestral links to Ireland, then make sure to catch our next number 6 programme in this 7-part Greening the White House series, when we'll be visiting the County Kildare ancestral townland of the 37th US President Richard Milhous Nixon, as well as the County Tipperary ancestral village of the 40th US President Ronald Reagan.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.